I knew my HOA wanted me gone the moment. I found a bright neon orange envelope duct taped to my front door like a ransom note written by someone who failed arts and crafts. Because inside it was a letter that started with, "Dear homeowner, your house exudes a disruptive aura," which is not something you expect to hear unless your home is haunted or you've upset a very sensitive magician. The letter went on to list infractions, each more ridiculous than the last. My lawn was too confident. My porch light was aggressively luminescent. My dog had a rebellious posture, and my trash bins were standing in a politically threatening formation. I stared at the paper wondering if maybe I had been pranked, but then I saw the signature at the bottom. Karen Lilac Hawthorne, HOA Secretary, written in cursive so sharp it could file a lawsuit by itself. I knew right then that she was behind all this nonsense, because Karen is the type of woman who alphabetizes her spices and reports birds for singing too loudly. I tried to let it go, but things escalated with the speed of a toddler after drinking an espresso. The next day, I woke up to find 3 HOA board members standing on my lawn at 6:12 in the morning with clipboards held like shields, squinting at my house like it had personally insulted their ancestors. Randy, the treasurer, kept poking my grass with a ruler and frowning, as if each blade had betrayed him. "The slope is off," he mumbled. "Unbalanced. Emotionally inconsistent. Emotionally inconsistent? It's grass, not a teenager going through heartbreak." Before I could ask why they were measuring angles on my lawn like they were planning a NASA launch, Karen walked to my driveway wearing her official HOA sash. Yes, she had a sash, and said, "We're evaluating your property for aesthetic compliance," as if she were announcing a royal decree instead of harassing me on a Tuesday morning. I asked why they didn't just send me an email like normal humans, and she said, "Emails lack the gravity of an in-person inspection." Gravity? Lady, you're standing on my lawn using a protractor on weeds. But I didn't want to start a war, so I remained polite until I overheard something suspicious. As the board gathered near my fence, whispering like cartoon villains, I heard Karen say, "If he doesn't fix the boundary issue, we'll have to move forward with removal." Removal? Removal of what? Me? My house? My dog? My sanity? I stood frozen in my driveway, holding a cup of coffee that suddenly felt very small and very insufficient for my life. When I approached them, they went silent with the guilt of kids caught stealing cookies. "Boundary issue?" I repeated, and Randy immediately tripped over the measuring tape, like a moose learning ballet. Karen stepped forward and said, "We have concerns that your property line is not where you think it is." I blinked. "It's literally on the deed." She smiled like a villain in a low-budget soap opera. "Deeds can be revisited." That sentence hit me like a tax audit. Something was going on. Something bigger. Something extremely stupid, but also potentially dangerous. So I did what any logical adult with 3 years of pent-up HOA trauma would do. I pretended everything was fine, went inside, closed the curtains, and started spying on them from every window like a raccoon with Wi-Fi. They stayed on my property for another hour, taking pictures, measuring random objects, and arguing over whether my mailbox was too charismatic. I finally saw them leave, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, fueled by caffeine and a questionable amount of popcorn, I decided to snoop on their HOA meeting, not illegally, just strategically. I walked by the clubhouse accidentally, just in time to hear Ray's voices through the window. I crouched behind a bush so badly, trimmed it resembled a confused hedgehog, and listened. "We need him out before construction starts," Mrs. Dunbar, the HOA president, said. "He's blocking the north expansion." "Expansion? Of what?" Randy added. "The developers are getting impatient. If he doesn't sell, we'll have to force compliance." Force. Compliance. That is not normal HOA language. That is mafia language, except with more scrapbooking. I gasped so loudly a squirrel judged me. My property wasn't just annoying them. It was in the way of something big, something expensive, and unfortunately something I was not invited to participate in. I decided that if the HOA wanted a war, I would give them one, but like a polite, homeowner-appropriate war with snacks and legally admissible evidence. So the next morning, I installed cameras along my fence line. Nothing fancy, just enough to catch them if they tried to force compliance with a bulldozer or a sternly worded letter. I even set up motion detectors, which immediately backfired by alerting me every time a leaf moved, every time a breeze existed, or every time my neighbor's cat dramatically walked through my yard like it was a runway. But things got very real when I caught Karen at 10 p.m. sneaking onto my property, wearing all black, like she was auditioning for a spy movie, but forgot to stretch first. She tiptoed toward my fence, pulled out a measuring tape, and whispered, "Yes, yes, this will do. This will do." For what? She took pictures, paced around, and left. I knew then that tomorrow would be chaos. And I was correct, because the next morning at exactly 8 a.m., the HOA marched toward my house in a formation so dramatic it looked like a parade for the world's least fun cult, holding clipboards like weapons and smiling like they had prepared a PowerPoint on why I didn't deserve rights. Karen lifted her megaphone, who gave her a megaphone, and shouted, "We are here for a mandatory emergency inspection of your home and land." Emergency? What emergency? My house was fine. I was fine. My dog was fine, except emotionally confused. I asked him if this was even legal, and Karen said, "Define legal," which is not something a grown adult on a neighborhood committee should ever say. They pushed past me like I was an extra in their musical about authoritarian landscaping and started inspecting everything. My garden hose, my mailbox, my welcome mat, too welcome apparently, my lawn chairs, sitting at an aggressive angle, my tree looked suspicious, and even my rocks, unregistered natural formations. But then it happened. The moment that proved this wasn't just harassment. Randy walked to the edge of my yard and hammered a new wooden stake into ground inside my property line. I froze. "What are you doing?" I asked. He stammered, "Adjusting the boundary." Adjusting the boundary. Like it's a napkin. I grabbed the stake, yanked it out, and said, "This is MY property." Karen stepped forward, eyes gleaming with villain energy, and said, "Not for long." And before I could even respond, we all heard footsteps in the woods behind my house. Loud ones, heavy ones. The HOA froze. I turned slowly toward the tree line. Someone, or something, was coming straight toward us. And that's when Section 1 ends. The sound coming from the woods was so heavy and thunderous that for a split second I thought the HOA had finally summoned some kind of mythical punishment beast, like a bureaucratic minotaur fueled entirely by paperwork and passive aggression. But then something even scarier stepped out. My neighbor Gary, shirtless, sweating, and carrying a chainsaw that was running even though I was very sure he did not know how to use a chainsaw safely, or at all. He burst through the bushes like he just fought his way out of a bear documentary, and the entire HOA screamed in the same pitch, which would have been funny if I weren't also concerned that Gary might accidentally remove someone's limbs simply by existing within 6 feet of them. "Why are you on his property?" Gary bellowed, pointing the chainsaw loosely in the HOA's general direction and accidentally revving it so it sounded like a swarm of angry bees with motor licenses. Karen ducked behind Mrs. Dunbar, who ducked behind Randy, who ducked behind absolutely nothing because Randy is shaped like a haunted breadstick and offers zero defensive coverage. I tried to grab Gary's arm before he gave someone an involuntary haircut. "Gary, buddy, let's go ahead and put the chainsaw down." I whispered, "We don't need power tools for this conversation." He ignored me and shouted, "They think they can bully you? They tried that with me when they declared my trampoline aerially irresponsible and my gnome statue emotionally disruptive. Well, not today." He swung the chainsaw in a passionate arc that made everyone, including me, reconsider our life choices. Mrs. Dunbar recovered first, adjusting her pearl necklace with trembling hands as she hissed, "This is a violation of HOA Ordinance 14, the prohibition of threatening garden equipment." Gary roared back, "This is my freedom equipment." At this point, the chainsaw sputtered, coughed, and died, possibly out of pure fear. Gary looked down at it in betrayal, then stomped off toward his house muttering, "Stupid machine. I'll bring the leaf blower next time." And just like that, he disappeared into the trees, leaving the HOA rattled, me mortified, and my dog very interested in the smell of gasoline. But after the initial chaos, the HOA regrouped with all the resilience of people who have nothing better to do and way too many laminated rules. Karen stepped toward me again, this time with a smug smile that told me she believed the universe had personally appointed her to ruin my life. As I was saying before the lumberjack interruption, She sniffed. This area is being reevaluated for community expansion. I folded my arms. You mean the mysterious construction project none of you bothered to tell me about? Randy looked at his shoes. Mrs. Dunbar inspected her manicure. Karen said, "We informed all compliant residents." Compliant. The word hit me like a brick in a pillowcase. So if I don't give you what you want, you're going to push me out? I asked. Karen tapped her clipboard with an evil little rhythm. We prefer the term relocate. Relocate? Ma'am, this is not a wildlife reserve, and I am not a confused turtle being moved across a highway. I wanted to argue, but before I could, I heard the sound of an approaching engine. Smooth, powerful, and way too expensive for our neighborhood. A black SUV rolled to a stop in front of my driveway, shiny enough that I saw my own emotional distress in the reflection. The driver stepped out wearing sunglasses, a suit, and the facial expression of someone who charges people for breathing the wrong way. "Afternoon," he said, pulling out a folder thicker than a wedding cake. "I'm here on behalf of North Star Development." The HOA immediately snapped to attention. Karen actually saluted. Mrs. Dunbar curtsied for some reason. Randy almost fainted with excitement. The man flipped through his papers. "We're beginning the acquisition phase for the new Heatherbrook North entrance. According to our assessment, the expansion area includes everything from the oak tree," he pointed, "to the creek bend," he pointed again, "to approximately where we stand right now," which was my yard, my actual yard, my entire yard. My house was sitting in the exact spot this mystery company wanted to bulldoze into an aesthetic gateway experience for the neighborhood. "We've made initial purchase offers to qualifying homeowners," the man continued. "You're the last property." Of course I was the last property. If there's a cosmic lottery of nonsense, I will win the nonsense every time. "I'm not selling," I said firmly. The man raised an eyebrow. We expected resistance. Karen clasped her hands dramatically. He's always been difficult. The developer ignored her and kept flipping pages. "There are alternate options." Alternate options. That's developer speak for, "We're going to make your life miserable until you cave." But I wasn't about to play that game. No. If they wanted a war, I was going to turn this property line into a battlefield of pettiness and legality, so fierce it would be studied in homeowner history books. So I smiled. "Great. Then I have alternate options, too." That made them pause. Randy whispered, "Does he mean violence?" "No, Randy," Karen hissed. "He means lawsuits." She wasn't wrong. That evening, I started Operation You Want War? Fine, let's war. Step 1. Fortify the property line. I installed 12 solar-powered floodlights along the fence. Not because I needed them, but because I knew the HOA hated visible lighting that wasn't approved by their illumination committee, which was literally just Karen with a ruler and a superiority complex. Step 2. Declare the property line a protected zone. I bought a giant novelty sign online that read, "Warning! You are now entering Sector 7. Trespassers will be photographed and possibly offered snacks." Funny enough to irritate them, legal enough not to get fined. Step 3. Noise deterrent system. This consisted of Bluetooth speakers positioned around my yard programmed to blast random sound effects whenever motion sensors triggered. The first night, Karen walked her dog past my house and set off the system, resulting in a booming ship horn, followed by cheering crowds, followed by a goat bleating. She screamed so loudly that 3 porch lights turned on down the block. Step 4. Community awareness. I told my neighbors everything. How the HOA wanted my land for their fancy expansion, how the developers were trying to push me out, how they were literally attempting to redraft my property line. And you know what? People were mad. The HOA had annoyed so many residents that suddenly I wasn't just one guy against the board. I was the unofficial leader of a suburban rebellion fueled by passive-aggressive rage. Mrs. Johnson brought homemade muffins for morale. Terry offered to build barricades using his nephew's Nerf equipment. And Gary promised to bring backup in the form of loud, shirtless witnesses. But the HOA wasn't giving up either. The next morning, I walked outside to find Karen on my driveway holding a tape measure like a weapon and announcing, due to rising tensions, the HOA is implementing a temporary emergency boundary buffer zone. Where? I asked. She pointed smugly. Here. She had placed cones, actual traffic cones, in a line across my grass, marking off a 10-foot strip of MY land as neutral HOA jurisdiction. I kicked one. It rolled into the street. She gasped like I'd punted a newborn. That is destruction of HOA property, she shrieked. It's a $25 fine. Bill me? I said. I already did. Of course she did. But the real shock wasn't the cones. It was what came next. As the HOA gathered around their fake buffer zone holding papers and muttering legal jargon they didn't understand, the same black SUV returned. This time with 2 additional vehicles behind it. The developer stepped out again, but now he looked impatient. Very impatient. He strode toward me. We need to finalize this acquisition, he said. And since you refuse to negotiate, we're moving to Phase B. What's Phase B? I asked. He smirked. Pressure. Then he snapped his fingers. The 2 SUVs opened their trunks, and 4 men in hard hats stepped out carrying spray paint wooden stakes and a rolled-up blueprint bigger than my dignity. The HOA gasped. I stared. The men marched straight toward my backyard gate. We're marking the site, the developer said. Beginning today, marking the site without permission on MY land. But before I could stop them, before I could yell, before I could even move, a loud alarm blasted from the back of my property. My alarm, my sensors. Something huge had triggered them. The workers froze. The HOA froze. The developer froze. And then, all at once, something crashed through the far fence with enough force to shake the ground. Something big. Something fast. Something I had not prepared for when I set up all those lights and alarms. The board splintered. The motion lights exploded on. Something stepped through the broken fence. And as everyone stared, someone whispered, "Oh no, what is that?" The moment the soaked, sputtering neighborhood peacekeepers retreated down the street like a defeated parade of wet pigeons, I knew the HOA wasn't done with me, because Mrs. Vanderhorn's expression, a terrifying mix of Botox, hatred, and the thrill of plotting, told me she was already calculating her next move with the intensity of a supercomputer that runs only on pettiness. And the very next morning I got my first sign, when I woke up to the sound of suspicious clanging outside, the kind of clanging that says either someone's building a fence or someone's building catapult. And considering my HOA's mindset, both were equally possible. So when I peeked outside and saw 3 board members crouched behind a hedge with binoculars, walkie-talkies, and what looked like a whiteboard labeled Operation Reclaim, I realized I had officially crossed from annoying to militarily invested in my destruction. And before I could even process that, Mrs. Vanderhorn herself marched up my driveway wearing camo pants and a matching vest like she had just come straight from a rejected audition for a low-budget spy film, announcing loudly, loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear, that my aggressive property modification had escalated tensions within the residential ecosystem, and therefore they were activating some nonsense clause called HOA Conflict Mitigation Protocol for which, as far as I could tell, was just a fancy term for we made something up because we're angry. And when I asked what protocol for actually involved, she smiled like a cartoon villain and said, "You'll find out," before dramatically adjusting her sunglasses, even though it was cloudy, and stomping off with the wind as someone who had just dropped a plot twist, leaving me to stand on my porch wondering what kind of legally questionable suburban nonsense I was about to face next. I didn't have to wonder long, because within an hour I heard a rumble, not just a small, innocent rumble, but a deep, earth-shaking rumble that suggested someone was either rolling in construction equipment or summoning a kaiju, and when I stepped outside, I saw the HOA had brought in what can only be described as a mobile command center, which was really just Tom from the HOA towing an old RV painted beige, with a giant banner that said, HOA Tactical Zone, taped crookedly across the side. And inside that RV I could see flickering screens, maps of the neighborhood with my property circled aggressively in red marker about 50 times, and at least 2 board members wearing headsets like they were directing an airstrike rather than arguing about grass height. And I knew the situation had spiraled really, really far when I heard someone inside yell, "Initiate Phase 2, in a tone that would have been dramatic if it wasn't coming from a man holding a muffin and a clipboard covered in glitter stickers. Phase 2 turned out to be a bizarre psychological warfare campaign in which the HOA tried to annoy me into surrender, and began when a group of volunteers, all wearing matching shirts that said, "Protecting Neighborhood Integrity since 1998, marched down the street chanting things like, "Respect the boundary lines," and "Compliance is harmony," like they were practicing for the world's most boring protest, and they stopped directly in front of my house, forming a human chain while Mrs. Vanderhorn stood on a step stool holding a megaphone, declaring that my refusal to bow to the HOA's demands was disrupting the communal vibe, and that the entire neighborhood would be participating in a 24-hour property pressure sit-in until I agreed to move my fence back 2 feet, remove the anti-HOA sprinklers, and donate $50 to something called the Neighborhood Peace Fund. And while she was making all these ridiculous demands, the volunteers, bless their very confused souls, started singing a wildly off-key anthem that sounded vaguely like a national anthem but mentioned hedges and driveway widths. And honestly, it was so surreal, I briefly wondered if I had somehow wandered into the filming of a mockumentary. But no, this was very real and very stupid. And it got even stupider when Mrs. Vanderhorn ordered Tom to bring out what she called the motivation amplifier, which turned out to be a massive speaker system that they set up on my lawn without permission, blasting HOA-themed remixes of popular songs, including one where the chorus of "We Will Rock You" had been changed to "We Will Find You," and another horrifying remix of Bad Romance that went, "I want your hedge, I want your lawn, I want your HOA compliance." And as much as I hated it, I had to admit begrudgingly that the sheer commitment to pettiness was impressive, because they kept going for hours chanting, singing, lecturing, making passive-aggressive comments about property values. And I wasn't sure whether to be annoyed, amused, or concerned that these people had this much free time. But then, just as I was about to go inside and pretend none of this was happening, everything took a turn when the HOA suddenly quieted down, and Mrs. Vanderhorn stepped forward with a kind of overly confident grin that always precedes a catastrophically bad idea, announcing that since I refused to collaborate with peaceful pressure strategies, they were now activating Phase 3, which she delivered like it was a climax of a blockbuster movie. And the volunteers gasped, like genuinely gasped, and I felt my stomach drop, because any Phase 3 created by these people was guaranteed to be both ridiculous and dangerous. And it was because Phase 3 involved the HOA constructed what they called a temporary visual barrier, which they claimed was necessary to shield the neighborhood from my non-compliant landscaping decisions, but which in reality was a 12-foot-high wall made of cardboard refrigerator boxes taped together with an amount of duct tape that suggested someone had raided an entire hardware store. And they began assembling it around the perimeter of my yard, like they were building a fortress designed by children. And somehow they were proud of this monstrosity, stepping back to admire it like it was a work of art instead of collapsing cardboard skyscraper. But the second a mild breeze blew through the neighborhood, the entire thing wobbled dangerously before toppling over like a domino effect of terrible engineering, landing directly onto a group of chanting volunteers, who immediately began yelling, thrashing, and insisting they were under attack, which caused complete chaos as the board members scrambled to rescue them from cardboard boxes that weighed maybe 2 pounds each, and Mrs. Vanderhorn started shouting into her megaphone that my hostile property environment had somehow caused their structure to collapse. And as she said this, she dramatically pointed at me like she was accusing me of treason on national television. But before I could even respond, Tom popped out from under a fallen box and yelled, "Phase 4. It's time for Phase 4," with the desperation of someone who had been waiting his entire life to say those words. And judging by the way the other board members suddenly exchanged nervous glances, I could tell even they weren't sure Phase 4 was a good idea, which was confirmed when Mrs. Vanderhorn hesitated and whispered, "Tom, we said Phase 4 was only in emergencies." But Tom insisted loudly that this was an emergency because the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity is hanging by a thread. And the moment he said that, I knew, deep in my soul, that whatever Phase 4 was, it was about to be spectacularly stupid. And I was right, because Phase 4 was the HOA's attempt at an aerial perimeter survey. Using a drone they absolutely did not know how to operate, and they launched it with the confidence of people who watched one YouTube tutorial and assumed they were now licensed pilots. And within seconds the drone spun wildly out of control, zipping through the air like an angry mechanical mosquito, narrowly missing 3 volunteers. smacking into the HOA's own RV command center, bouncing off a mailbox, and finally, tragically but hilariously, diving straight into Mrs. Vanderhorn's perfectly styled bouffant, becoming tangled in her hair while still whirring loudly, making her look like she had been attacked by a robotic squirrel, and as she screamed, spun in circles, and attempted to punch the drone out of her hair while the volunteers panicked and Tom yelled, "Landing protocol. Landing protocol." Despite having no idea what that meant, I realized that whatever little sanity the HOA had left had now completely evaporated, and even though I should have been worried about what they would do next, I found myself laughing so hard I nearly fell over. But that laughter vanished the moment Mrs. Vanderhorn finally freed the drone from her hair, glared at me with the fury of 1,000 rejected Pinterest boards, and shouted, "This means war," in a tone that made it very clear. She actually meant it, and the worst part was I believed her, because the HOA wasn't backing down, not after this, and as she marched her troops down the street, hair frazzled, pride wounded, ego aflame, I knew Section 4 of this insane suburban war was coming, and it was going to be even wilder. By the time the next morning rolled around, the neighborhood looked like a disaster movie had collided with a suburban craft fair, because the HOA, led by Mrs. Vanderhorn, had clearly decided that subtlety was for amateurs and that we were officially entering full-scale property warfare, and I could see it the second I stepped outside. Orange traffic cones arranged in confusing mazes, chalk lines marking official boundaries, that twisted around my yard like they were auditioning for an abstract art exhibit, and volunteers in matching T-shirts running around carrying clipboards, measuring tapes, and what appeared to be spray-painted sticks they called territory markers, while Mrs. Vanderhorn paced back and forth in her tactical vest, plotting out their next ridiculous move as though she were a general preparing to conquer Europe instead of a HOA president trying to bully one guy's lawn. And honestly, I had to take a moment to admire the sheer commitment to absurdity, because every single person involved looked like they were auditioning for a slapstick comedy about suburban tyranny. I knew I couldn't just stand there, so I grabbed my coffee, my dog, and a megaphone I found in the garage from last year's neighborhood emergency awareness drill, which never happened because no one takes drill seriously unless it involves judging your property, and I started narrating my own counter-strategy loudly, because if they were going to play war, then fine, I would make them laugh, panic, and question their life choices, all at once. First, I started Operation Confuse and Confound, which involved installing motion-activated sprinklers along the perimeter of my property, each set to a different random timing schedule, so that whenever a board member tried to sneak a tape measure onto my lawn, they would be blasted with water, disoriented, and forced to retreat while yelling things like, "This is harassment," and "My shoes." My shoes. I didn't even feel guilty because it was technically self-defense, or at least that's what I told myself as I hid behind my porch while Karen, soaked and fuming, shook her fist at me like a villain in a Saturday morning cartoon, muttering about illegal hydroaggression and unauthorized wetness, which I assumed were actual clauses in her imaginary HOA rulebook. Next, I escalated with Operation Optical Illusion, which involved strategically placing mirrors, reflective surfaces, and garden gnomes with googly eyes around my property, so that every time they tried to survey the land, they got confused, stared at themselves, and argued amongst each other about who was trespassing first, resulting in a domino effect of chaos that had Randy tripping over cones, a volunteer accidentally painting over another volunteer's clipboard, and Mrs. Vanderhorn spinning in circles because she thought the gnomes were mocking her. And just when I thought things couldn't get any more ridiculous, I decided to introduce my piece de resistance, the inflatable obstacle course, a giant, garish contraption that spanned half my yard, full of tunnels, slides, and bouncy sections, all strategically designed to slow down, confuse, and mildly humiliate anyone attempting to cross my property, because if the HOA wanted war, I would turn my property line into the suburban equivalent of a carnival death trap. And when the first volunteer stepped into the tunnel, got stuck halfway, and screamed for help, the others panicked, the developer muttered something about liability, and Mrs. Vanderhorn nearly passed out from sheer frustration, all while I watched from the porch with my dog on my lap, who seemed very pleased with the whole situation. But the climax came when Karen, desperate and red-faced, climbed onto a ladder to try to remove one of the inflatable sections, clearly intending to reassert her dominance, And just as she leaned over to grab it, I triggered a motion sensor that released a small bucket of confetti and glitter directly onto her head, causing her to scream, wobble, and tumble backward into a conveniently placed kiddie pool full of water, which exploded with a splash so dramatic it soaked 3 volunteers, 2, Cones, and Randy, who had been valiantly trying to record the breach on his phone. An entire neighborhood erupted into pandemonium because no one was prepared for this level of absurdity. And as the developer yelled something about insurance, Tom tried to negotiate a ceasefire, and Mrs. Vanderhorn sputtered water and glitter, I realized the HOA had officially lost control of the situation. Their meticulously planned harassment campaign had crumbled spectacularly, and I, soaked in caffeine and victorious glee, had somehow transformed my yard into a fortress of chaos, comedy, and very polite revenge. But just as I was about to celebrate, a deep rumble shook the ground. My dog barked furiously. The inflatable obstacle course wobbled dangerously. And from the edge of the street, a massive construction vehicle appeared. The kind was scooped the size of a small living room, barreling straight toward the chaos, with the developer at the wheel, muttering something about fast, tracking the expansion. And in that exact moment, I realized that while I had won the battle of pranks, illusions, and sprinklers, the HOA's war machine was still active, relentless, and absurdly committed to taking over my property. And with my heart pounding, my coffee spilled, my dog jumping in alarm, and Mrs. Vanderhorn clinging to the soggy remains of her dignity, I knew the next few hours would define the ultimate showdown of suburban insanity, where wit's courage and the strategic use of garden tools would determine once for all who truly ruled the chaotic battlefield that had once been my peaceful little yard. And even as the engine roared louder, the inflatable flapped violently in the wind, and the neighbors watched from behind their fences, wide-eyed, I readied myself, prepared to defend my land with everything I had, because if the HOA won a war, they were about to get the most ridiculous, most chaotic, most unapologetically hilarious resistance they could possibly imagine.